Lesson 2 for the Sermon on the Mount. Last night we looked at the Beatitudes, and something that will be very important as you're reading through the Sermon on the Mount, which I hope that you will take the time to do, is to actually read it as a sermon. So often, the Sermon on the Mount is isolated into different parts and just kind of plucked up, and you read a nice piece here, and then you pluck another piece up and you read a nice piece there. And it's never taken to be a coherent whole. And if you do that, you will really struggle to understand what it is that Jesus is doing. But with the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has organized it intelligently and intentionally. And so you start out with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. And what Jesus is doing here is he is showing you just exactly who it is that has access to the good life. And the answer is anyone and everyone. It doesn't matter how put off to the side, how beyond the pale you might be from the human point of view. The gospel that Jesus brings, which is that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that at-handness holds true regardless of any human position you might find yourself in. So after having answered the question of who really has access to the good life, now he's going to transition to another fundamental question that humans have been wrestling with since the beginning, which is, who is a really good person? What makes for a good person? And that's where we pick up here a little bit later in chapter 5. And so if you can, I would encourage you, let's go to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. And right after he has finished talking about all these people that you would consider to be kind of beyond the pale, really having direct access to the kingdom, Jesus feels the need to clarify. He says now, starting in verse 17, "Don't think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets." Why would he have to say that? Probably because people were thinking that that might be what he's doing. He was upturning, he was reversing the standard way of people thinking about the way that God interacted with people. And they had so ingrained or so intertwined their view of how God interacts with people, who was blessed, who had access to the kingdom, that they had so intertwined that view with the law, with Torah, that they thought that Jesus, upturning the way God interacts with people, was upturning the whole law. And so he says, don't think I've come to do that. I have not come to abolish the law. So what has he come to do? He has come to fulfill the law. To fulfill the law. That is to say that he is going to show us what the law was originally intended to do. The target that the law had all along, that is what Jesus is going to show us how to hit. You could just ask yourself this question. What change was God trying to achieve in giving people the law? When God gives the Israelites his law, what is it that he hopes the law will do? What is it intended to do for those people? And to get a little bit of a handle on that question, I want you to reflect on your own experience of the law. How is it that you experience the law? Where does the law come in for you? And at least for me, the law comes in when there is something good to be done and I don't want to do it. And so the law pokes and prods at my human person to get me to do what I really didn't want to do, but it was good, and so the law compels me to do it. On the other hand, there might be some things that I do want to do, but which are evil. And I really want to do it, and so what does the law do? Holds me back. It constrains me. And so on the one hand, the law pokes and prods at the human person when there is good that it does not want to do. And then it ties down and holds back and constrains the human person from doing what is evil when it really wants to do what is evil. So functionally, the law comes in when there is some kind of deficiency or twistedness in the human person, either when it doesn't want to do what is good or when it wants to do what is evil. But ask yourself, is it really God's ultimate intention that the human person would just go through life poked, prodded, tied down, and constrained? Is that God's grand vision for humanity, that the law would serve this purpose? I don't think so. I don't think so. So here's the big headline. Jesus' agenda is not to give us either more or stricter law. That is not Jesus' agenda. His agenda is to fulfill the law, to show us what it was meant to do from the first place. And this is simply because humanity's problem is not a lack of law. I hear that Canada has crime. We have the same problem in the States. So here's my question. Why don't we just pass laws against crime? Surely that would solve the problem. If the lack of law was really humanity's fundamental problem, then God would just give us more law. But as we know well and truly, a lack of law is not the fundamental human problem. Rather, Jesus comes to restore the human person itself, such that the human person would no longer need to be poked and prodded, that it would no longer need to be tied down and restrained, but that the human person itself, in all of its parts, the heart, the will, the spirit, the thinking, the feeling, the body, that all the parts of the human person would be so formed that it does by nature what the law requires. A beautiful illustration of this is Jesus hanging on the cross. And if you recall, there you're reading the Passion narratives in the Gospels, there Jesus is hanging on the cross, and the people that he has come to save are mocking him and cursing him. They're humiliating him. They are taking pleasure in his excruciatingly painful death. And they're saying, this man said that he was the Savior of Israel. He can't even save himself. Hey, if you're really the Messiah, then why don't you come down from the cross? Then we'll believe you. And what is Jesus' response to such malicious and destructive attacks on his person? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now here's the question. Was it hard or easy for Jesus to do that? Do you think Jesus is up there, right? And there he is hanging on the cross, and he's thinking to himself, you know, maybe those sons of Zebedee had something going when they were calling down fire on people. You know, maybe that was a really good idea. I just really want to curse these guys. But I shouldn't do that. I should bless them. And so he says, through gritted teeth, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Did Jesus have to utter that through gritted teeth? Of course not. It was actually easy for Jesus to bless when cursed. And that is because his human person had been so formed that it did by nature what the law required. Jesus did not have to be poked and prodded to do what he really didn't want to do. Neither did he have to be tied down and constrained from not doing what he wanted to do. Jesus was the kind of person for whom the deeds of the law were simply the natural expression of who he was. And that is what it looks like to fulfill the law. To bring the law to its intended end. And this is not something that should come out of left field. This was prophesied. If you remember the prophecy in Jeremiah 31:31, I love it when the numbers line up like that. Jeremiah 31:31 through 33. Verse 33 says, "This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." What we are looking at here is the total transformation of the human person. Consider how Jesus approaches the law and human behavior in other places in Matthew. So if you were to just go to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the end of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, and have a look at verse 16. He says, "You'll recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit." So imagine you're growing trees, and a tree is not producing the fruit that you want. And so you look at the buds where the fruit really ought to be, or maybe it's producing bad fruit, and you look at the bad fruit, and you just focus all of your attention on where the fruit is. How successful of a orchard will you have? Well, if you're just focusing on where the bud is, not at all. Where would the wise orchard owner's energies be spent if he wanted to produce trees that had good fruit? The tree! The health of the tree. Not where the fruit is being produced, not scrutinizing the bad fruit, but trying to promote the health of the tree. Because if the tree is healthy, guess what will happen naturally? There will be good fruit. And so, Jesus is not interested, primarily, in the effects, the actions, the externalities of the human person. Where is Jesus primarily concerned? The health of the tree. And this is precisely what he says later in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 18. He's talking about things that come into the person, and he says that there is nothing that comes out, nothing that goes into the person that defiles the person. But then verse 18, "But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." So you think about the person that commits adultery. Was adultery just forced into them? They really didn't want to do it, but it was just crammed down their throat, and then they had to commit adultery. Jesus says, where did that come from? That came from inside of you. Now, remember, the law constrains that part of the human person. But Jesus is saying, ultimately, the focus is not on the activity. The focus is on where the activity came from. A little bit later in Matthew, Matthew 23. Matthew 23, starting in verse 25. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup, that the outside also would be clean. So what's the law doing? What's your experience of the law? The experience of the law is you got to make sure that everything is buttoned up nice and tight and that you're doing all of the right things. But that is not the fulfillment of the law. What is the fulfillment of the law? To get the inside of the cup clean. And if you get the inside clean, then the outside takes care of itself. So Jesus moves beyond right or wrong action to the source of action. That is what the law was targeting all along. And that's Jesus' focus. The fundamental thing at issue in Jesus' exposition of the law, right? If you go now back to chapter 5. Go back to chapter 5. And if your Bible has headings, then you might have things like anger, lust or adultery, divorce. Jesus is going to be explaining various laws in the Old Covenant. And so what is fundamentally at issue in Jesus' exposition of the law is this. If you want to obey the law, then do not aim at keeping the law. You have the wrong target. If your object is to keep the law and you aim at keeping the law, then you've missed it. For Jesus, if you want to keep the law, you shift the focus and you aim at becoming the kind of person for whom keeping the law is a natural expression of who you are. This is, I think, precisely what he means. If you drop down just a couple of verses now, right? So that's verse 17. Don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Drop down just a little bit now to verse 20. It says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, then you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now you read that, and if you're anything like me, you think, well, I'm out. If what Jesus means is you have to do more righteous things than the scribes and the Pharisees. But when Jesus says that your righteousness must exceed, he doesn't mean that you have to do more righteous things. It is that more of you must become righteous. More of you. The righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees was basically this. Just so long as you don't break the law, then you are righteous. And that sounds fairly commonsensical, right? Right, just don't break the law, then you'll be a righteous person. Okay, let's try that on for size. The law says, don't murder. All right, so I will not murder, and then I'm righteous? That's God's grand vision for humanity, is just to not murder each other? Turns out that not murdering is a pretty low bar for righteousness. He says, don't commit adultery. Okay, well, I haven't slept with anyone else's wife, so I've made it, guys. I am righteous because I haven't committed adultery. As long as I don't break the law, I'm righteous. And that was essentially the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. But that's a pretty poor measure of whether you're righteous or not. So the exceeding righteousness of the kingdom reaches deeper into the person and then brings it face to face with the heart of God behind the law. Probably the biggest obstacle that you will have to avoid when approaching the Sermon on the Mount in general, but the section that we are about to approach in particular, the most troubling obstacle is taking what Jesus says as either more or stricter law. If you take that approach, then the sermon is going to crush you. And you're going to come to passages toward the end where he's talking about, turning the other cheek and giving to people that ask of you and not resisting evil. And you're just going to throw your hands up and give up if this is just more and stricter law. But that is not what Jesus is here to do. Right? If Jesus was coming to do that, then it would turn out that Jesus would literally be meaner than Moses. Moses said that you have to, not murder people. Jesus adds 5 more things to the list. Moses says you have to constrain your genitals. Jesus says you got to constrain your eyes and your hands too. And so Jesus is meaner than Moses, if these were laws. But they are not laws. Jesus is not interested in constraining more of your person. He is interested in dealing with the person directly, the heart directly, and rooting out the very source of evil. And so if these are not laws, then what? What are we dealing with? He is illustrating a kind of life. What Jesus is doing with these contrasts, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, he is illustrating a kind of life lived in the kingdom. In fact, he is giving you a collection of self-portraits. This is a picture of who Jesus is, showing you a life that is lived in the kingdom of heaven and that is available also to you. And this kind of life is one that is pervaded with agape love. The first contrasts with respect to murder, adultery, divorce, vows, retaliation, these are starting at the street level, right? Murder, adultery, that's right there where you live, right? That's street level stuff. But then Jesus starts to get a little bit more conceptual with vows and retaliation. And then finally, there is the contrast with respect to love. And love is what he's getting at all along. Right? When Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. For Jesus, love is the fundamental thing at issue. And so the life that he is illustrating is one that is pervaded with agape love, starting from the street level, reaching all the way up to the conceptual pinnacle. So, the order will be important. You don't want to start with retaliation. If you start there, you're bound to fail. You need to start at the street level, where Jesus does. Start with anger. Start with desire. Then we can start to graduate into the more complex and advanced techniques. But we'll start there. We'll start at street level. And I want you to see the 2 primary functions that these illustrations are serving. The first function that the illustration serves is to bring to the surface what is already in your heart. It will bring you face to face with all the ways that you're twisted up. That's the first function. Second function is to show you what true righteousness looks like. To show you what the kingdom heart does naturally. That will be the 2-pronged approach that Jesus has. With that in mind, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, now we're into it. You have heard that it was said, verse 21, you have heard that it was said, to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out of there until you have paid the last penalty. But I say to you that anyone who is angry at his brother. Jesus shows that murder is actually just one kind of thing in a larger collection. And this collection of things all harm and destroy the human person. Anger is the natural and spontaneous response to having your will crossed. You want to be doing something, someone prevents that from happening, anger alerts you to this. So it's a natural, spontaneous response, and if it stayed there, it wouldn't be such a disaster, and it wouldn't create such disasters. But the problem is, anger doesn't stay there. It then moves from spontaneous response, from your feelings, it then moves from there directly into your will, where you make decisions. And you have to decide to either hold on or let go of this anger. And so often you decide to hold on to it, and anger is the kind of thing that must always be justified. No one likes to be angry for no reason, do they? No one likes to think to themselves, well, I'm really angry, but I guess that's wrong. No, I'm angry and I'm right. Think about, this is such a funny story in the Bible. Think about Jonah, right there at the end. He doesn't want to go to Nineveh, and he finally, through a rather fishy ordeal, winds up in Nineveh. He preaches to the city. They repent, and God doesn't destroy them. Jonah goes up onto a mountain to watch the destruction that he hopes is going to happen, but thinks it probably won't. And God comes to him and says, Jonah, what's going on, man? And Jonah says, I knew this would happen. I knew that if I preached, then they would repent and you wouldn't destroy them. And now I'm just burning up inside. And so God leaves him and just let him stew for a little bit. Kind of feels bad for him, and so he, has a plant that grows up, provides some shade for him, and Jonah is very happy about the plant, right? But then God sends a worm, and it eats the plant, and then Jonah's hot again, and Jonah just starts fomenting with rage. And God comes to him a second time. And he says, are you right to be angry about the plant? Are you right to be angry about the plant? And do you remember what Jonah said? Yes, I'm right to be angry. Angry enough to die. That's what he says. See, anger is never the kind of thing that you hold on to, but really realize that it's not that big of a deal, but you're just really angry about it because that's just what you want to do. No, anger is always something that has to be justified. And so, as you move your anger from spontaneous response to having your will crossed, you move it into your will. Now you have to decide to hold on to that anger. And now that you've decided to be angry, you have to now justify it so that you can feel righteous in your anger. And now you have righteous indignation. Eventually, the whole life organizes around this anger in order to support it and to justify it. And then I have become an angry person. Then contempt comes in. Whoever is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. But then whoever insults his brother The word that Jesus uses here is raka. Probably comes from an Aramaic term meaning empty. So it's probably an insult, kind of like, you empty-headed person. There's just nothing going on inside of you. It is a contemptuous term. Contempt moves further on from anger. Anger is more visceral. Often anger is associated with wanting to harm the object of the anger. Contempt moves a little bit beyond this. It could be a little bit more sophisticated. Contempt says, not necessarily that I want to see you harmed, but that I don't actually care what happens to you one way or the other. You're nothing to me. That's contempt. And actually, we give children terrible advice with respect to interpersonal squabbles by asking them to be the bigger person. Well, if they're the bigger person, what does that say about the other person? They're small. They're little. They're insignificant. I'm too big to be dealing with you right now. What is that? That's contempt. That's contempt. Finally, whoever says, you fool, will be liable to Gehenna, the trash heap. Whoever says, you fool. Now we add something to contempt. Yeah.
That's anger.
That's anger. There you go. When someone says, you fool, it's now no longer just contempt. I don't care what happens to you one way or the other. This is now contempt plus malice. Malice. You want to see that person destroyed. And the language here that's being translated really doesn't capture in English. Because now, you could call someone foolish, you could call someone a fool, you could even call yourself a fool, right? It doesn't really have the punch. And if I really wanted to give you the punch, I'd probably have to actually curse at you to give you the effect. I won't do that. But this isn't someone that is silly. This is someone that is stupid. This is a word with no humor and which intends to injure the other person. Now, various people have taken these, as I've said, as additional laws to what Moses said. But Jesus is not giving us 3 more things not to do. And just as long as we don't break these laws, then we're righteous. Right? Just as long as I keep my anger under control, I'm not excessively angry at this person, as long as I don't verbally assault another person or insult them, then I am righteous. That would be the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And if that were the case, we would find all kind of legalistic workarounds. We even have some. You don't have to, what is the saying? I don't get angry, I just get even. What is that? That's a legalistic workaround. Jesus said, don't be angry, so I won't do that, and I'm righteous. But I'll still get even, because Jesus didn't say anything about that. Now, in point of fact, he did, but whatever. We have these legalistic workarounds. All across the country, we have well-intentioned mothers forbidding their children from calling their siblings fools. And they think that as long as the children avoid that, then their children are good. But of course, not calling your sibling a fool is a poor measure of righteousness. Not murdering is a poor measure of righteousness. So too is not being angry, not insulting, and not assaulting. In the same way that not going to Calgary and not going to Vancouver is a really poor strategy for getting to Ottawa. But if you intend to get to Ottawa, then the natural outcome of that intention will be not going to Calgary and not going to Vancouver. Jesus is illustrating all the places we already go. We already go to anger and contempt and malice. We already go to these places. He knows that you have these in your heart, And he is bringing them to the surface so that you can finally contend with them, so that you can see them for what they are. But then he shows us the positive side. He's not just telling us not to do these things. Isn't it strange that in showing us how to fulfill the law about not murdering, he then goes on to talk, starting in, let's see, verse 23. Isn't it strange that on a law about not murdering that we have, starting in verse 23, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. What in the world does this have to do with murder? Well, it's because Jesus is showing you what the law was trying to do all along. God is not trying to merely constrain you from murdering. God is trying to turn you into the kind of person for whom murder isn't even an option. He is trying to transform you into the kind of person for whom anger and contempt and malice are actually uninteresting. And that kind of person is what does what is described here. When it says leave one's gift at the altar, this would be the most sacred ritual in the Jewish system. Now, we don't have much experience with offering animals on altars, but we do have experience with a sacred ritual, namely the Lord's Supper. And so could you imagine, there you are, you're partaking of the Lord's Supper, the bread has already gone around, the cup is about to come through, and you remember, there is a rift between me and my brother or sister. And in the middle of that ritual, you get up, you go out, you try to make amends, you make that right, and then you come back and you take the cup. But you interrupt the Lord's Supper to do that. Once again, if you try to turn this into a law, it's not going to go well. And you'll start to think about all kinds of legalistic questions that come to the surface. Well, what if my brother refuses to reconcile? Do I have to do this every time? Does this mean that I should only go to be reconciled if it's during the Lord's Supper? Or should I also stop what I'm doing if maybe I'm just driving to work? And if that's the case, then how am I ever going to get any work done? Right? So all these legalistic things bubble to the surface if you take this as a law. But these are the wrong questions because Jesus isn't giving a law. Here's the proper question. What must this person's quality of life be, such that they would routinely interrupt sacred rituals to pursue reconciliation with their fellow human being? An abbreviated question, because that one's too long. Abbreviated question. What kind of person does that? It's not a law. It's an illustration of a kind of life. What kind of person would do that? And when you start to answer that question, now you're on the right track. This is akin to the question, what kind of tree produces that fruit? What kind of heart produces that action? And if that is your focus, then everything else is going to fall into place. But if you're so myopically concerned with the fruit, well, you're going to miss the whole thing. Jesus is painting a picture of a kind of life, of a kind of person who will not allow ritual to take priority over love, who is deeply grieved when she has offended her sister, who deeply longs for open fellowship with each of their brothers and sisters. This is the righteousness beyond the scribes and the Pharisees. Not just doing more righteous things, but more of you becoming righteous. The final illustration, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you'll never get out of there until you pay the last penny. Once again, this is not a law, but Jesus is also not giving you a strategy to avoid legal fees. All right, that's not Jesus' aim here. Oh, how can we minimize legal fees? All right, let's spend some time on that. No. Here's the question. What must this person be like, such that they would actively pursue reconciliation with a legal opponent? See, when you're taking someone to court, you hate that person. You want to fleece them. You want to squeeze every last drop out of that person. That's the typical course of the world. But Jesus is saying, what kind of person would actively pursue reconciliation even with their legal opponent? Because that is the kind of person that Jesus was. Only a person who genuinely cares for the well-being of that other person. That is the picture of kingdom righteousness that Jesus sets before you. So once again, we're dealing street level here. Anger, insults, reconciliation. We're going to move to another street level issue. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, that whoever looks at a woman in order to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. He goes on to say, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Remember the first purpose of these illustrations, to bring to the surface what is already in your heart. To force you to contend with what is actually going on inside of you. What Jesus is describing here is not mere temptation. Merely being tempted does not rise to the level of sin. The Hebrew author tells us that Jesus himself was tempted as we are tempted. So temptation does not rise to the level of sin. What is being described here is the intent, an act of the will to lust. And lust is so corrosive to the human soul because it is so opposite of what we were made for. It cuts against the design of the human person. The proper design of the human person is seen with Jesus on the cross, or you could think of his reflection on the cross when he is at the table with his disciples taking the Passover meal. And he says, "This is my body given for you." That is right in line with what the human person was designed for. My body given for you. But what does lust say? This is your body given for me. I am going to use your body for my gratification. And that is opposed to kingdom righteousness. That is opposed to the design of the human person. So you're looking at a person in order to obtain some kind of sexual gratification from that look. But then Jesus transitions, right? It's not just to bring to the surface what's going on inside of you. It is also to show you what the kingdom heart looks like. And so he says that you should be tearing out your eye and cutting off your hand. Volunteers. I'm seeing a lot of two-eyed faces here. Two-handed arms. Good, okay. So what's going on here? Well, I think at the surface level, the hyperbole, an overstatement for effect. That Jesus is saying that it doesn't matter what you have to do to get this sin out of your life, that's what you need to do. And I think that it works perfectly well at that level initially. That may well be the first step that you need to take. But if you reflect on this for any amount of time, I think you will see that Jesus is not here, once again, just giving us more laws or stricter laws. Jesus actually is calling us deeper and exposing the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Scribes and Pharisees say, as long as I don't break the law, then I'm righteous. As long as I don't commit adultery, then I'm righteous. And if you take that approach to Jesus, then you will come away thinking, as long as I don't lust, I'm righteous. Well, I lust when I look at people, so I'll just not look at people. And there have been people that have taken that strategy. Throughout church history, there have been various hermits that say, you know what, I'm done with all of this, I'm going into the desert, I'm not going to see another human being, and I won't lust anymore. And as long as I don't lust, then I will have accomplished what God wants for my life. And so, can't look at you, sorry, but I'm trying to avoid lust, and this is what God really wanted, was for me to avoid lust, and so I'm not looking at anyone. How righteous is that person? That's the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. But Jesus did not solve the problem of looking wrongly by not looking. Jesus solved the problem of looking wrongly by looking rightly. That's how Jesus solved the problem. Jesus did not come to redeem you from your sexual desires. Jesus came for the redemption of your sexual desires. And so we have advice that, once again, we give to young people, or maybe yourself, which is to bounce your eyes. Right? You see someone that you're attracted to, you have that temptation, look away. And once again, at the beginning, that might be what you have to do. But not looking is a poor measure of righteousness. What we want to get to is to have our human person so formed that it resembles the person of Jesus, such that we can look at a person and not lust. And not even just not lust, but to see them as whole persons. Pornography is a problem, but not looking at pornography is a poor measure for righteousness. You must contend with what is actually going on inside of you. Your vision of the other person as an object to be used. The vision of yourself as someone terribly deprived who just needs to get what they can. And correcting these fundamental things will turn you into a person that is more like Jesus. The word if is critical in Jesus' teaching. If your eye causes you to sin, then pluck it out. So, just ask yourself the question, is it your eye that's causing you to sin? I think you would have to say no. I could pluck my eyes out and still be just riddled with lust. Is your hand the thing causing you to sin? If that were the case, you would do well to cut it off. But that's the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. What Jesus says is, all of these things come from the heart. And if you make the tree healthy, then the good fruit naturally is produced. Now, we spent a lot of time on these first two, and we can go through all of the rest of these exactly as we have done in these first two. But far more important is that you get to see the vision of what Jesus is trying to do, rather than just focusing on trying to obey them as laws. So if you learn to approach them as illustrations of the kingdom life, bringing to the surface what is already in you, and then showing you what it looks like when there is a healthy tree naturally producing good fruit, then you will be in a much better position to actually do what it is that Jesus said to do. Thank you.